All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the Grant Writing for Beginners workshop. My name is Diane, and I work for Southeast Uplift, and we are proud to be joined today by Dr. Rafeel Wasif, who is both an assistant professor at Portland State University and also an associate director of the nonprofit institute within Portland State University. So, Dr. Wasif, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Diane. I think I'm very excited to do this workshop on grant writing for beginners. Again, I'm really hoping that this is more of an interactive session. As Diane rightly pointed out, I'm a professor at the Portland State University. I'm also leading their nonprofit initiative as the associate director, and I love working with nonprofits. So Diane got me excited about working with some nonprofit in the Southeast. I used to live in Southeast for a long time, just moved to the burb, so my heart still lives in Southeast. So I'm really excited to be presenting this grant writing. One thing I would really mention is normally I do a lot of these grant writing slash teaching in person. So a lot of what I normally like to do is back and forth with examples. So some of that will continue in this space. So while I'm talking to a laptop, I'll be asking a bunch of questions. There will be some ice-breaking questions. So just kind of like putting that out. Some of these you can put in the chat, but also like some of the thing will probably be good if we are having a back and forth a little bit more. I'm really wanting to make it a little more concrete with examples rather than just kind of making it more of a just like a simple thing that people are listening to but not really kind of following. So that's my hope. Again, knowing the Zoom limitations, also knowing that it's 6 or 5 p.m., I'll try my best to kind of keep you guys excited about grant writing. Okay, so grant writing. So this is like some of the things we've already want to capture with the grant writing workshop. Welcoming participants again. I would love to know more about you guys. Where are you coming from? We'll talk a little bit about the overview of today's session and objectives. We've already introduced me in terms of what I do and what my role is going to be. And I love the word facilitator rather than a teacher because I really want to hope to facilitate this conversation more than just kind of being like a teacher. So that's my real hope as I'm kind of building some of these kind of conversations today. So one thing maybe we can start with just to kind of get a sense of who's in this room. If you could just do a quick round of introductions in the chat box with your name, organization, and one thing you want to achieve with this workshop. So quickly just kind of put in the chat. Again, just to make it a little more interactive, I'm open to people using their cameras, but if someone doesn't feel comfortable, there's a lot of other reasons why people would not want to use it. But I would love for you, most of you, to just kind of put a brief introduction of your name, your organization, and one funding goal that you really want to get out of this workshop in the chat. And I'm kind of keeping out from the chat. Cool. So we have Pete with Portland Tenants Association, Steve Clary. It's awesome. Montevilla. I used to live very close to Montevilla. Cool. Roseway Neighborhood Association, Chris, Debbie. It's awesome. So there seems like a lot of people want to get some funding and the sense of how to do these things. Uh, grant writing, Sam. That's cool. Anyone else wants to kind of put into some of these chats? Nikki, Friends of Good Rain, awesome. Kind of like, yeah, that's great. We'll be talking a lot about the procedures and terms around grant writing. Not explicitly, but I'll give you a sense about some of those conversations. And again, these are more bigger conversation, but I think my hope is today with the grant writing workshop, you at least get a sense of what the funders are looking for, what are the basics 101 of thinking about that, and some of the things around the budgeting too. Heather is also coming from similar space from Sam. Lee from Oregon Queer Historic Collective. Heidi looking from, that's cool. That seems like a really diverse and really cool group of individuals that we have here. And again, this is a great opportunity for you guys to also kind of like know each other. Probably some of you already know each other, but just kind of get a sense of who is in the room. Uh, Feel free to continue the introduction, but I'll kind of continue with some of the conversation that we want to continue just in the interest of time. We've already done some of these things. Type your answers in chat. We've already talked about it and focus on being clear, compelling, and concise. Some of the conversation that we already are kind of like some of those things. Uh, so let's start with an example. And in this part, I'm happy if someone wants to raise their hand, somebody wants to kind of contribute. You can also chat in the chat box. But this is an example that somebody can be facing in Portland. So, and this is again like theoretical example made out of ChatGPT for for honesty's sake. So there is healthcare access crisis in Portland. 50,000 person plus our uninsured residents exist in Portland area that lack primary care. Emergency rooms are overcrowded. Chronic conditions are getting untreated. Unhoused individuals are facing severe health risk. So you have this problem in Portland and you're a nonprofit. How would you find funding to resolve this problem? Anyone has a, just kind of like a quick conversation. If anybody wants to kind of put there, anyone who wants to volunteer. The question of funding, how would you normally get funding for resolving some problem like this?
I'll jump in. I feel like it actually is, it's a pretty insurmountable problem. So now just looking for like little piddly dollars like I am makes it seem a lot easier. But to
Mhm.
me, the first thing I think is you need to find some like mega donor national organization, something big for something like this.
So big donor. Why do you think there you need to have a national donor?
Oh, I don't know. It just seems like a lot of money. I don't know if there's an organization that has that much money in here in Oregon alone. I guess
Mhm.
that's why I say national, but it's possible.
No, that's a really good question. So you're thinking like a problem of this massive size, you need a lot of money for that, right?
It seems like it, yes.
Mhm. As a small nonprofit, can you do something about it?
I personally would not think so.
Okay, okay. That's fair. That's fair. Anyone else think that you can do anything about this problem as with a nonprofit, with a small nonprofit?
I mean, my initial thought was just to break it up into smaller, more manageable chunks. So
Mhm,
finding like subsects of that 50,000 people and then
mhm,
kind of approaching it that way and trying to find different avenues for funding that would
mhm.
match. Yeah.
No, that's a really good. So like kind of breaking that into like more people. So like 50,000 plus people, that's a really big thing that probably a government intervention or some really massive intervention needs to be done, right? But can you do something smaller, like maybe take care of 100 uninsured patients as a small nonprofit rather than focus on the 50,000 people? Would that potentially help maybe 100 people at least? Maybe. And so if you're looking at like maybe helping 100 people, maybe 1,000 people, what kind of funder would you be looking for in Oregon that could potentially fund some of these things? Anyone has an example?
I think that that's actually a really good idea, and it's already changed my thinking about the insurmountable nature of this dilemma. If you break it into who are these 50,000 people and you parcel off, recent immigrants or
Mhm,
veterans or women with children or something like that,
mhm,
then you could then go find people who focus on that individual group, and then it feels a little more manageable to what I had first
mhm.
thought.
So it definitely feels much more manageable if you're focusing maybe on the veterans or people of, different ethnicities, people of different backgrounds. Uh, what kind of an organization in Oregon would be likely to fund this? And again, some of you have rightly pointed out maybe a big national foundation would be interested in doing some of the things at the national level, but at the local level, DHS, maybe, yeah, that's a good one. Department of Health Services. I'm always confused with all these acronyms. Yeah, that could be a good one. You can potentially ask them for a grant. That's a great idea, actually, in terms of thinking about government. Who else could be it? So government is a good option. Who else could be potentially giving you some money for that stuff?
Northwest Health Foundation.
Yeah, Northwest Health Foundation. They're very focused locally. That's a really good example of someone that would be willing to do that. So maybe DHS, Kaiser Foundation, North Health West Foundation, those are different groups that may be willing to fund some of these projects. But are they more likely to give that money to a larger nonprofit or a smaller nonprofit to do the work? Anyone working with some larger nonprofits or smaller nonprofits? What kind of things are larger? What kind of things are foundation more likely to fund, like a larger nonprofit or a smaller nonprofit? Yeah, I guess so Lee is saying like perhaps smaller because we are more in need. So yeah, that could be true. Like Lee, as you rightly pointed out, maybe some people are more likely to fund the smaller ones because they're more in need. But how do you actually tell your story that you are a better person or better organization to give that money to rather than the larger nonprofit? And this is the kind of question we'll be asking, like how can you stand out in this grant writing process to really kind of stand out in a way that a DHS or a foundation are more likely to give you the money instead of a larger nonprofit or other nonprofit that are in that same space. So that's what we'll be focusing on, is to writing that compelling grant that is more likely to get you that funding instead of kind of working on some of those things. Okay, so let's keep going.
I think that if you can really convince that donor that you directly connect to that population,
Mhm,
they may be more willing to go with a more grassroots, local, small
mhm, mhm.
nonprofit.
No, that's a really good point. So, but how do you convince them that you're the person that is more locally connected?
That I have no idea, which is why I will defer to you.
That's what you're doing. And that's what we are doing in this grant writing workshop, is try to make that compelling story to kind of get those funders interested in you, but also telling your story in a compelling way so that they actually start deciding that you are the organization that they really want to fund. So just to kind of give a broader landscape of the type of funders that exist in Portland or Oregon and other things, there are four different kind of people that are organizations that may be willing to give you some funds for your work. Some are private foundations. So Myers is a family foundation. Private foundations are basically one family or one individual or one corporate entity are mostly focused on kind of like giving the donation. So Myers family is kind of like Myers family. Public foundation. So Oregon Community Foundation is an example of a public foundation that is more kind of focused more on not only just one donor, but like a bunch of different donors coming together to give grant. The third thing that, as you guys rightly pointed out, are government agencies. So DHS is one a good example. Corporation is the fourth one, where basically some kind of like maybe Kaiser Foundation, maybe because they're also kind of thinking about corporation, but also like maybe Nike Foundation or something. I don't know some of those have, but most corporations also have a foundation giving platform where they also give different ways of money to different organizations. So just to kind of summarize, there are four different ways where you can actually get money to fund some of your program in addition to individual donors, right? Individual donors are definitely a really big part of that. But in terms of just thinking broadly, these are the four different ways of getting some money for your organization. And the grant writing starts with this process of like, who do you want to target for getting some of these funds? Who are the best people that are going to be best suited to give you some of those funds? And how do you write that compelling story that I've already talked about? So how do you find some of these people that are willing to give you some of this funding? So research is really key. Has anybody ever used Foundation Center? Do I see any raise? Anyone knows about Foundation Center? I guess Samantha, I see your hand raised. Lisa, I see your hand raised too. So Foundation Center is a really good place to start finding foundations, at least, that are more likely to fund you. And what you do, and I can probably do a little bit of a later, like that's a whole thing in itself. So basically go to Foundation Center and try to find organizations that align with your priorities. So some foundation may be looking for helping organizations alleviate the problems of climate change. Some of them will be focused on serving the populations that are vulnerable. Some of them may be focused on health issues. So we really need to find organizations that are kind of similar to what you're doing. If you're helping vulnerable populations like the houseless population, you may want to see an organization that is funding some of that stuff. A lot of the problems emerge when organizations apply to foundations whose mission is very different from what they're looking for. If an organization is focused on climate change, it is very less likely to be giving money to something that is completely not related to climate change, right? Another really important part, and I think some of you already mentioned this, is the geographic service area alignment. Different foundations, some foundations are national, but a lot of foundations are actually focused on a very specific area. So Myers is a really good example. Collins Foundation is another great example. These foundations are focused on Oregon. So it'd be really good to kind of see where these foundations are actually giving money. You can also reach out to them to kind of see their website are also a really good place to kind of see where they're giving. Again, a lot of organizations struggle with some of these problems because they may apply to an organization whose priorities are very different, or they're kind of working in Alabama and you're saying like, hey, give us money in Oregon. So those are really important things that you really need to be thinking about as you're thinking about trying to find foundation that may be willing to give you money. Another really good way of finding some of these organizations is most foundations also have a history of people that they've donated or organization that they've donated. So it's always good to kind of see historically which organizations have been funded, and if those organizations seem similar to you, then you're more likely to get money from those foundations. Another thing, of course, is trying to align with funder priorities. Every foundation mostly has a very clear priority that they're targeting. Some may be working on DEI things, some may be working on climate agenda, some may be working on helping the houseless populations, some may be working on health issues. So again, you need to kind of get a sense of what they are doing and what they are focusing on. And the best way to kind of find it are the Foundation Center database, but also going to their website to kind of get a sense. The third thing that I always say is every foundation is different, but some foundations very much like to be contacted, and there's a person that could be contacted, and you can contact them and get a sense that you're going to be interested. So again, there are different ways of doing that, but this is still a very human process, and trying to get a sense of which organization and foundations are kind of similar to you is the first part of grant writing. Because not even before writing a grant, if you cannot figure out the foundation and if it doesn't align with you, no matter how good of a grant you write, you're not going to get any resources from them. So this is a great example, Meyer Memorial Trust. Uh, and I actually got that from some of their website stuff. So mission of Meyer Memorial Trust is advancing racial, social, and economic justice in Oregon. Geographic focus is funds projecting benefiting Oregon communities. Priorities are resilient places, empowered youth, collective prosperity. So based on this, you find it on Foundation Center. How many of you think that you guys should be applying to Meyer Memorial Trust as one possible place? Why or why not? I would love to hear. Just look at what they're saying and see if you would actually be a good potential recipient of some of their funding. Anyone wants to chime in?
I mean, I can speak to. I think that the thing that you want to be looking at is if there's mission alignment, right? Can you draw a connection between what they're saying is their priority and what your organization is doing on the ground? And can you adequately tell a story about how those things are connected? You know, if you're using the medical example and they're looking at, advancing racial, social, and economic justice, you want to connect, hey, these problems with getting people the medical services they need intersect with these ideas of racial and social and economic justice. It's the people who are poor, unhoused, and disproportionately people of color who suffer from these gaps that we're seeking to close in our organization. That would be the kind of thinking that I would be doing to determine what you're asking.
So would you think that if you're working for an organization, do you think your organization is kind of fitting into some of those Meyer Memorial Trust funding priorities?
I don't think that I don't think that our organization would apply for most grants, if any. I'm mostly here to refresh my skills, just more broadly,
No,
possibly
that's a
for
fair
future
assessment.
organizations. But yeah, I don't think so. But maybe for another organization for sure.
No, I think Erin is saying so. I think Camp Out would potentially be a pretty good potential candidate for some of their grant because a lot of their priorities would really, align well with some of the things that Meyer Memorial Trust is. But again, the reason that I put Meyer Memorial Trust is two parts. One is like obviously it's here. The second part is just kind of like in that foundation center database, you can kind of start getting a sense of like if you actually align or not. And again, that's a really important part to just start as even as a conversation at the first part. So just to kind of like summarize some of the conversation that I'm already having, but also kind of thinking about what foundations are looking for when they are looking for nonprofits to fund. First thing, they're trying to find an organization that align well with the mission. So Meyer Memorial Trust may be looking for an organization that advances some DEI goals. It may be looking at organization that help with some collective prosperity by helping some entrepreneurs of color or different kind of groups. So that's a really important part. So foundations are looking at your mission statement and trying to understand if your mission is actually well aligned with what they are doing. And foundations for all of their work are actually existing to achieve certain goals, right? And most of the foundations exist because whoever started the foundation had a desire to do something in the world. So it could be helping mental health, it could be helping other things. And so they're always trying to find the first thing is like, is your mission aligned with them? If you're working with houselessness, then a foundation that works on houselessness may be a good alignment for you. If you're working with some queer population, then some of those organizations may align well with you. So that's the first part. Mission alignment is the first thing that they're really looking for. The second part that is really important for a nonprofit to show to a foundation is that the foundation really wants the work to be done, but they're not likely to be funding an organization that is not ready to do that work for them. Especially with small nonprofit, it could be just like 2 people running a nonprofit, it could be 3 people running a nonprofit. So in this grant writing application, not only do you have to tell about the mission alignment, but you also have to show that you actually have the capacity to do what you're saying that you're going to do. So if a nonprofit that works with like uninsured population, if they do not have the right kind of medical staff or people to kind of do that, the foundation would be like, yeah, that's a great mission, but I don't know if I want to really work with them. So as a nonprofit, you really have to show that you're ready to do the work that you're saying that you're doing. And a lot of that is shown in the grant writing process. Like you talk about the staff, you talk about your capacity, but you also show about the previous experience that you have done with some of those work. And again, those are all examples of showing to the foundation that you actually have the capacity to do. And another thing that smaller nonprofits can do that kind of make them stand out is they can actually show that they have much more community rootedness than larger nonprofits because you're really in the community. And that's a really good demonstration that you actually have the tools to do what you're saying that you're doing. Another thing that foundations often try to do is they want to look at innovative projects. Like everybody is doing different stuff, but instead of saying like we just need to hire 2 staff from this funding, you actually show that like you're helping the marginalized populations or whoever you're going to serve. The other thing that is really important is to kind of show that there's a community need for what you're doing. So again, as an organization, you're saying that I'm going to help like 50 uninsured patients. You're talking more about the community rather than saying like, as a nonprofit, I need more money, to staff more people. Foundations like to see the impact clearly. And so if you can really show the community need rather than the organizational need, you're more likely to get the thing. And the last thing that's really interesting is, of course, like in this new liberal environment, these foundations are really looking for clear, measurable outcomes of like what is going to happen in that process. Like, I'll get 50 uninsured patients, I will work with them, and after 6 months, this is going to be the process improvement or their condition improvement and that like that. So the more clear and specific your outcomes are, the more it becomes easier for a foundation to be like, yeah, this is a good organization to fund. So again, going back to some example, again, this is very theoretical. This is a problem statement that one organization may have put talking about some of the problems of finding some organization and the problem of low-income families that struggle to access basic needs. So there's problem statement. Can anybody look at it and see if there's any problem with that problem statement? Anyone wants to guess? Anybody wants to kind of read? I know it's late, but I think it's a really interesting example of what to write in a grant versus what not to write in a grant. Anybody wants to take their chances?
I think, I mean, just looking at the wording, what stands out to me immediately is that like we want to help because it's the right thing to do is great. And that's like morally and ethically like A plus, but might need like some more specifics about what concretely does that look like.
Mm-hmm.
And then also like families will continue to suffer. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
How, and then maybe, and this could be wrong, but like, would it be beneficial to keep the language positive? Like, if you don't give me this money, this is what's going to happen as a like, or with this money, we could impact this. That would be my guess.
No, I think those are really good parts. So I think going back to some of the language, we want to help because it's the right thing to do. If you write that in your grant, that shows to the foundation that while you have a great heart, you do not have the readiness to do what it needs to be done. So instead of we want to help people because it's the right thing to do, you kind of say something very specific, like we want to help 500 people, or we want to help 100 people. And again, going back to some of the language, like it could be much better, but like the idea is there's a very clear problem that exists. And the foundation would probably know that you cannot help 5,000 low income families, but you're telling the bigger story of what the problem is, right? And in your problem statement, you can be like 5,000 low income families are struggling with this thing, there's this problem, and we want to help because helping 500 low-income families can lead to better employment outcomes or better education outcomes or better health outcomes. So the more specific that you are with your problem statement, the easier it becomes for the foundation to be like, well, this is interesting. Maybe we want to fund this. So again, the problem statement sounds very vague and very generic. You need to be as focused as possible in your problem statements, like 5,000 families, this is what I'm going to do about it. And without funding, this problem would exist. And without funding, these social demographics may get even worse, and you provide some statistics. So the more focused the problem statement is, the easier it becomes for them to understand. And same thing in the project description. What is a problem with the project description that could be a problem for a foundation if they're looking at this?
I think Michaela said in the chat, we will figure out the logistics as we go. And that, yeah, that phrase also stood out to me.
Okay, so if you say will figure out the logistics as we go, what does it show to the foundation? And I'm sorry, it's very complicated to also open the chat, so I'm kind of keeping an eye out as well. And I apologize for being, okay, I see Debbie is also saying, Yeah, so I think Michaela is also right. Yeah, they need to find the alignment between what you're doing and what all the things are doing, right? Again, going back to some of this conversation, we'll figure out the logistics. That just shows that you don't know what you're doing. And going back to some of the conversation that we were talking about, it showed that you're not ready to say to do what you're claiming to do. We don't have exact numbers yet. Again, shows that you don't even have done like a needs assessment. We know there is demand, but how do you know there is demand? We are confident that this will help us do something useful for the community. Again, not specific and measurable. What are you going to do with those, with helping those 5,000 low-income families? So those are really important things. The more specific you are, the more, I won't use the word data, but more evidence generally, because it could be numbers, it could be stories, it could be different things. The more easier it becomes for the foundation to be like, okay, these people know what they're doing. And especially for smaller nonprofits, you're already fighting against the stereotype where the foundations are thinking that they're not ready to do some of this work. So you need to be as focused as possible to kind of like put those numbers in, know what's happening, also give exactly what you're thinking about doing. And we'll be talking more about that in the logic plan, not too much, but like I think those are really important things that really need to be done. Okay, let's keep going.
Can I ask a question? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
I'm just curious. So I know like in job searches recently, there's been like a complete shift in how recruiters and like corporations go through their applications. And a lot of them will use AI to search for particular phrasing or keywords, and then those are the only ones that get across to management. Do you know if there's been any sort of trend in that in like the nonprofit sector or yeah, I'm
You're
just
in the
curious.
whole Pandora box because I do a lot of work on AI and nonprofits and foundations. So there is some movement there because a lot of the grants are being written by AI and foundations are also kind of starting to work on kind of using some of those tools too. Some of them may already be doing that. So I think that makes it even more important to kind of have those buzzwords. We live in a neoliberal environment, So it's really good to kind of have those, not buzzwords, but like things that are more specific and measurable, even more in that space, honestly. And I hope that helps. Some foundations are using it. Some foundations are definitely curious about using it. Some foundations are very hesitant to use it. But again, as I always say to nonprofits, you want to put your best foot forward, right? So I don't know if that helps in the answer.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, Nancy, I think you also have.
Yeah, even if they're not using AI, the person that's reviewing the application, they know their program, they know their vernacular, all of that. And so they're gonna be looking for like, how are these grants going to help me meet my goals as an employee of this foundation? And so when you authentically use the language and speak the same language as them, then you're helping to create the case that like we're aligned. We're on the same page and how we're looking at this.
No, I think Nancy, you're totally right. I mean, I don't look at grants, but I look at admission letters all the time. I'm busy, honestly. I have a million things to do. And I'm honestly looking for alignment as much as I want to help as many students as possible. But honestly, bias wise, like anybody's going to be more biased towards a person that is making their job easier. And so if you can really connect that with some of the things that they're looking for in their language, then the likelihood of them looking at you more favorably just increases. No, that was a great question. So just kind of going back to some of the other things, and again, this is examples of just like how things normally work. Budget justifications, anybody can see any problems with some of those problems too? Like what's happening with budget justifications? If you put that as a budget item for a foundation. I'm not looking at the chat, so someone is, I can see somewhere happening on the chat. Let's see. Yeah, Aaron is right. It's too vague. Like you're not telling them like 70,000 is going for this staff and who's the person being hired, what they're going to do, how many hours they're going to do. So the more specific you are in your budget, the more likelihood that exists to get the funding. honestly. Outcomes is again, outcome of impacts, another good example, 500 food boxes, 50 families. Yeah, you just kind of be as clear as possible with the outcomes too. Like 500 food boxes, 50 families served. As much as you can be specific, that kind of helps people to kind of get a sense of how you're doing to do that. Another thing, and that's a really important part, sustainability plan. Any problem that may exist in the sustainability plan? Or maybe not. Maybe I'm just tricking you guys this evening. Anybody can see any problem with the sustainability plan? Okay, I'm checking the feedback is fun.
It's not particularly sustainable, right? I mean, that's the
Mhm.
it's not a sustainability plan. That's
Mhm.
what it looks like to me.
Mhm. So yeah, if you're just saying like I'll try to get some money from business, government, and donor, it just like seems like you're just gonna try do it. But if you have a very explicit idea of like, I'll try to contact this donor, or if I have an idea with this government, I've talked to them, or this will become a self-sustaining model based on certain KPIs or matrices, that shows you the foundation that you're thinking of it as a sustainable plan, right? And again, the more you can make their life easier, the more they'll be like, well, oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe this person has an idea. So to make it sound as much as possible that you've already thought about the sustainability, if there's a component of sustainability in your project, that just increases the likelihood of your project going to get funded. And again, these are some examples of some of the things that people are kind of making mistakes on. And the more specific you are into some of these things, the more likelihood increases of getting a grant. Another thing, and I just had a lot of bullet points, but I actually started to put some actually examples of problem that emerge in some of these grants that are happening. So something is called scope creep, which is basically promising that your nonprofit can realistically deliver. So, and this is a good one actually. We will eliminate food insecurity in Portland by providing free meals to everyone in need. Is there a problem with this? What's happening with this one? If you're a nonprofit that puts it in the foundation grant writing letter, that's what you're going to do. What could be a problem with that? Let me go back to the chat again. Okay, Diane has a good point too. Andrew has a good point. Lee, go ahead. See Lee's hand raised. Lee, do you want to talk, or do you just want to put it in the chat? Communication. Uh, Anyways, anyone wants to give? Oh, Lee's kind of taking a second to unmute. Well, Lee is unmuting. Anyone else wants to kind of give a sense of what the problem would be if you're saying that you're going to eliminate food and hunger from all of Portland?
I mean, it does say right under it, it's an unrealistic goal. It's not. If a nonprofit is asking for a new program that's too broad a scope to tackle initially.
Yeah, and I think it's just untrue. Like there is going to be problems of hunger and food problems in Portland. So that's the other really important part of just like not promising thing that you're just saying. Like it could be like, yeah, I can help eliminate food insecurity of 23 kids in Southeast Portland in the Lens area or something like that. And then the foundation would be like, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, yeah, that's possible. But if you're saying that you're eliminating food insecurity, again, that's just too much of a ask that the foundation would be like, that's not true. That's impossible. Over promising outcomes again, by the end of the year, 100% of participants will be employed and self-sufficient. Again, they're looking for realistic goals. Maybe you can say like 70% or 65% or 80%. But again, you're just kind of over promising. And I think they kind of see through these things and kind of be like, hey, have they actually thought about it? Another thing is lack of evidence. A lot of times people say that there's a problem, but they're not providing any evidence of that problem. So if somebody says like many people in our community struggle, so we need funding to help them. Again, what are people struggling with? Is it mental health? If it's mental health, do you have some statistics to back what you're saying? Do you have some anecdotes to back what you're saying? Do you have some qualitative research to back what you're saying? Again, foundations are looking for clear evidence to show there's a problem. If I say their Southeast has a problem with houselessness, I would say like these amount of people are houseless in the Lens area or Brentford Darlington or whatever you're talking about. So it's as specific as you are with your evidence. And it doesn't need to just be numbers. You can make some really good anecdotes, newspaper articles. All of these things are good evidence to kind of put into your narrative to show that there's actually a compelling need. Other problem that show up very often with some grant writing is poor funder alignment. Again, this is a great example. You go to Meyer Healthcare or other Kaiser Foundation, and you ask them for an arts program when they're like, "Yeah, we want to just focus on healthcare." The funder is going to be like, "Well, this sounds like a really interesting project in Lens or different parts of Southeast, but it's not aligned to what I do." So you really need to kind of be looking at the alignment of what you're doing and also kind of connecting some of the things, not going too beyond about what you do. But if they're looking at an arts program and you're looking at an arts program and they're looking at healthcare, maybe making that connection of arts and mental health, or making that connection of art and helping people's health outcomes, then you're starting to make a connection with what they are doing and what you're doing. Again, if you're working with an organization that is helping the houseless, even though the word houseless may not directly be like healthcare problem, but once you connect the problem of houselessness with healthcare issues of vulnerable population, a Kaiser may be interested in you then because they're like, well, that makes a lot of sense. There's this problem, and this is how they are connected with that. If you're helping build a park in some part of Southeast or something like that, or generating funds for that, again, you can be like, well, this is what we are doing, and this is how it's related to healthcare. Again, not going too far. Again, I know nonprofits that just want to get money and then they push too much about what they're doing. But making those connections obvious is a really good way of kind of really signaling to the funder that your organization is much more closer to what they want to do. Another thing that people kind of get into trouble with is just having unrealistic budgets. You're asking for a large sum without a detailed cost breakdown. If you say like we need $500,000 for a 1-year project without really providing the details on how you're going to use those $500,000, the funder would be like, well, the project sounds interesting, but they have no idea about how much money they want, how they want to use it. Are they prepared to use this money? Again, going back to that question of organizational preparedness that you really need to show. If you put these unrealistic budgets, then that's a really big signal for the funder or the foundation that you haven't done your own homework. And that's a really important part to be thinking about. Nancy, you have something to say?
Just a little anecdote on that.
Mm.
There was a grant application to Southeast Uplift that was for a mural, and the line item in the budget was a whole lot of paint.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so it was clear that there wasn't research on like how many gallons, what would it cover, how big this is, like something like that would have made us feel like, okay, they've done the research rather than just asking for the top amount that they could ask for.
Mhm, mhm.
It made it less compelling because it wasn't specific and it lacked that detail and it didn't get funded.
No, and that's a great example. Like if I were that organization, I would have been like, this amount of gallons, this is the market rate, this is the assumption that we are putting. The more concrete you are with those budgetary things, that's a really good sense. And again, we don't often know how much the money, like we have a rough sense of how much it's going to cost, right? But at least with the foundation part, they want to see that thought process that you've thought through some of these things. And the thing that gives you such a big edge when you're kind of being like, hey, these amount of gallons, this is the estimate, this is the large scale estimate, this is a small small bandwidth estimate. And again, that just shows to them that they have thought through these things. Another good example, and again, I've already talked about it, is weak problem statements that we've already talked a little bit. You say there are a lot of problems in our community and people are struggling. So problems exist in every community. What is the problem that you want to focus on? If it's mental health, that's fine. If it's houselessness, that's fine. If it's crime, that's fine. If whatever you're thinking about, but you need to be very concrete about the problem. So for instance, if I'm writing a grant for Lens, I would be like, hey, there's a problem of mental health problem, and the statistics according to Multnomah County, 25% of residents in Lens are suffering. And again, this is just making something up, but now I'm putting data or numbers or evidence. I mean, I don't want to use the word data too much, but evidence to show that there's a problem. I'll cite some articles that are coming in the newspaper to be like, well, this person said that. I'll even do some interviews with some communities to kind of sense what's happening. Again, the more specific you can be with your problem, like 25% mental health issues, 20% whatever you're thinking about, people are struggling. What are they struggling with? The more specific you get with the struggling part, the more likely it shows that your problem statement is very focused rather than kind of being more generic or much more vague. Some other thing that I'll kind of want to talk about when you're thinking about applying for a grant, organizational readiness documents showing all the things that you have already achieved, 501c3 status or fiscal sponsorship, because especially working with the government and a lot of foundations, 501c status, for some of you that don't know, that's the nonprofit status you need to have to operate legally as a nonprofit. So a lot of governments, as well as a lot of foundations, are more likely to fund 501c3. So you need to kind of do all of the legal stuff before you kind of become ready to apply for grants. Clear project concept. Again, the more vague you are, there's a problem, there is trouble, that doesn't get you further. But if you have a very clear idea of like, this is the amount of houseless population that I want to serve, this is the aim for my project, this is what I want to help with, the more you're clear about what you want to do, the easier it becomes for the foundation or the government to be like, okay, this is interesting. Community need evidence. I've already talked a little about it. Could be data, it could be anecdotes, it could be stories, it could be interviews. But the more you can show that there's a clear need in the community about whatever intervention you're doing. And again, some people kind of become very humble about these things, like, oh, we're just building a park, there's no community need. But it's good to be humble in everyday life. But once you're writing a grant, it's really important to be clearer and be like, there's a very clear problem with there. There's a problem with not having parks or whatever. So the more evidence you can do without over blowing it, like not having a dog park in Lens is not gonna cause like nuclear war or something. But it's just still is going to cause some trouble or whatever the problem is. So the more clearer you are with the community need evidence, the easier it becomes. Budget framework that we'll be talking about in a second. Another really important part is implementation, and I won't talk too much about it because in the interest of time, but the idea behind implementation timeline is you should ideally have a very good sense of how much time you need to do your project. And timelines could be month 1, this is what I'm going to do. Month 2, this is what I'm going to do. Month 2.5, this is what I'm going to do. The more clearer your timelines are, the more it shows to the foundation and the funder that you've thought through these things. And again, these timelines have to be realistic because they also understand some of these things. But the more you've already thought through all of these things when you're applying for a grant, the more likely it is that the founder is be like, well, this person already has a great budget. They also have a need, but now they've also put a really clear implementation timeline that makes me understand how it's going to happen, what are the timelines, but also kind of holding them accountable if the timelines are not met. And the last part is evaluation plan. A lot of donors and foundations are looking at like, well, you did something, but did it actually even work? The question is like, how are you actually evaluating what you are doing? Like you maybe provided some schooling or different things to a houseless population, or provided some other resources like healthcare resources. How are you going to see if what you are trying to do actually has an positive impact on their health? So there are all kind of different ways of evaluating, but the idea is you need to have some kind of a plan of like, this is how I'm going to evaluate if my project is successful or not. And that's another thing that the funders and foundations, if you have something like that, they'll be like, yeah, this person has already thought about some of these things too. And again, the more detail you give, the more likelihood it makes sense to them that you're ready to do what you're planning to do. And a lot of them also need evaluation to make sure that their donors are also kind of seeing the impact. So having that evaluation plan really helps. And the last part is key personnel identified. Again, the more you can show like this program manager is going to do this in 0.2 FTE time or 0.3 FTE time or whatever you're using that, the more clearer those things are in the grant writing process, the better it becomes, easier for them to kind of understand what you're going to do. So I know I covered a lot of things in this checklist, but anybody has a question before I keep going on this? I know there was a lot of different words that I was throwing around. Okay. No questions that I can see. So just the next part that I want to talk about is the application problem itself, application process itself. How would you develop a compelling grant writing process? So a lot of these things are repetitive because a lot of them things are related. But initially, you need to define the community problem clearly. What is the problem that you're trying to address? Is this houselessness? Is it healthcare? Is it something else that you're thinking about? Is it mental health? Is it schooling? Is it education? So kind of defining it as clearly as possible is important. The second part is who is affected. And it seems very obvious for a lot of people to be like, yeah, this person affected. But it's very important to really kind of nail down who is the audience that really want to help. Is this the people in Lance? Is this people in Brentford, Darlington? Is this like another place? Who are the people that you're trying to work with? Are these communities that are suffering from mental health? Even in those communities are these BIPOC communities. So the more clearer you are about who's getting affected, it gets easier. The next part is what is the scope? We cannot solve everything in Portland or Southeast or whatever. So the more clear about this scope is like 50 people or 100 people or 1,000 people that I'm going to help. That kind of gives you a sense of like where you're kind of narrowing your thing. Again, the problem itself is big, Now you're saying like this is the affected population, and the next thing is that you're kind of focusing on what the scope of your activity would be. You cannot help everybody with everything, right? But you can maybe help them with their mental health needs. You can help them with their education needs. You can help them maybe with some uh, dietary needs or stuff like that. But you cannot do everything, right? It's just kind of fighting some of that thing. What evidence supports this need? Again, the more data, the more anecdotal evidence you have, the more interviews you have, the more statistics you have, all of that kind of really helps is that. And the last part, demonstrate why your organization is qualified. I've talked a lot about budgeting. I've talked about timelines. I've also talked a lot about individuals involved. All of these things show that your organization is ready to do something like that. And another really important thing, especially for smaller nonprofits, that they can really benefit from is show that you're really rooted in the community. A lot of foundations really look for really community engaged processes and solutions. So if you can also show that you've been working in this community for the last 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, you know these people, blah, 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 whatever evidence you can show for that, that kind of strengthens your application itself. So again, I've talked a lot, lectured a little bit, but let's kind of go through some examples to see what is happening here. So can all of you look at it and maybe one or two of you think about what may be a problem with this proposal or grant proposal, in which they're talking about the problem, they're talking about the persons who are affected, they're talking even about the scope of their work, they're showing evidence, and why they're also showing is like why this nonprofit is a good example. What could be a problem with this grant writing? If you were a foundation, what would be a problem that you would find with this? Anyone wants to take a dig at it?
I see evidence of like scope creep.
Okay.
Like
By that.
it needs a more kind of like defined scope for who specifically like could be helped with a grant.
Mm-hmm. That's really important. Like maybe like even more digging down on low-income families, like this specific low-income family that could be affected by that. That's a really good example. So maybe some problems still exist. How many of you think that this is very well written? Anybody who would kind of basically say that this is actually a very well written grant, or like some of the things in grant? What are some of the good things in this grant that you can see?
I think it defines kind of some of the statistics around the problem well, if not specific enough. Uh, like I think that there's actual hard numbers in here about like who's affected and how.
No, I
I
think
do
that's
think that especially the YS is pretty sparse on details. Like, you know, it's not just about how many people have you helped, but like why are you suited to do the work that's going to help these people? You know, it's not it's it's more than just capacity, it's like specialized ability. Why is your organization equipped to do this work specifically?
Yeah, I think they're still very generic about what they've done, but it could also have been like we've worked with uninsured patients, these amount of people, we work in these communities, this is where our office is. Again, the more specific you get, the more likely you are to be like, oh, this is makes sense. So Heather also has good bigger problem capture, but not what the organization will focus on. Again, more smaller specific thing, right? It cannot help 50,000 people at the same time. So again, that could be good to kind of be like, what are we actually going to be doing rather than just kind of these big things. But yeah, I think just to kind of summarize, I mean, the good thing that they're doing is like they're putting hard numbers on what's happening, 50,000 person, like instead of saying like, oh, there's a problem of uninsured residents, they're like, nope, Multnomah County says there are 50,000 plus people uninsured. Why is this problem important? Because of this is leading to more ER visits and poor health outcomes. I would have liked some kind of causality in some research papers kind of cited there just to kind of be like, well, this is what's happening. The second part is, again, they are still focusing a little bit, not completely on low income families, but at least they have a sense of who the people are in terms of like who the people are. Scope, again, 1 in 5 adults lacks healthcare. Again, kind of like much more statistics numbers. Again, that's something that kind of helps. Evidence is really good. Like at least they have given evidence. Uninsured patients face 40%, something like that. So a lot of the time, good places to find evidence of what you're doing are research articles, policy papers, newspaper articles. Again, those could all be good evidence of showing why there's a problem. Again, they haven't given a lot of information about what they're doing, but YS would have been really good. Like, this is what we have done in this community. We've worked with these amount of people. These are our staff that are really trained with some of those things. And then it's kind of helpful. Do you guys think like if they had put like an expertise of one of their staff person in YS that has really worked with uninsured residents, would that really help their application or not? Like John has worked with like 10,000 uninsured residents in their life or something like that. And they have these degrees that have helped them work with some of these things. Would that help the YS part? Would that kind of harm their application? Like providing specific expertise of why you're qualified to do that as an individual to or as an organization, would that potentially help them or harm them? Yeah, I think Lee's correct. Like if it's validly applicable, then it's really helpful. Like again, I applied to a recent grant with the federal government, and yeah, I think I put that like, hey, I do a lot of work around nonprofits. I have 10 years of experience working with nonprofits. I've worked with these nonprofits. Again, just because I already have that, that kind of demonstrates the evidence that I know what I'm doing, right? Again, the more you can show that, the better likelihood you have to kind of win the grant. So I'll just kind of keep a time out. We'll get into the most exciting part, which is the budget development. But before that, any questions that anyone may have? Okay, I don't see any questions. Okay, so then let's just continue with some of the budget parts that is important. So we've already talked about the need for a problem assessment, what the problem is, how you're going to solve this, what are the timelines. But one of the really critical parts are the budget, because organizations and foundations are really looking at the budget as an illustration of you know what you're doing, you know you've already thought about the resources, and also kind of an evidence that you'll be a good steward of the money or the resources that they're giving you. And so normally this is like the template from SE's Uplift that I think Diane you sent me. So I'm kind of keeping that just to kind of make it as connected as possible. But these are some of the things that nonprofits need to put into their budget: personnel, costs for professional services, stipends, hours, general volunteering hours. If you think some of the work is going to be done uh, through volunteering, then you kind of be like, yeah, this is the amount of volunteers we expect, this is the amount of work they'll do, this is the amount of time they're going to spend, and this is going to save us so much actual employee time. Same thing about travel. Like if you're traveling, you should put that. Like if you're doing some kind of project in Bend, and if you live in Portland, like it'd be like, yeah, this is the amount of money uh, to do that. Supplies and materials, again, the more clear you are, the better it is. And the best way of kind of putting supplies and materials, just Google it and try to find what it costs on market. Honestly, the best way of finding like these are the amount of pens I need is just go on Amazon and be like, well, this is what I'm finding in Amazon. Again, it doesn't have to be like very specific, but the more likely things seem to be, the more likely they're going to be like, yeah, this makes sense. If you start charging $10 for one pen, they'll be like, yeah, this organization has some problems, you know? So the more realistic you can do and just kind of find some of those things. Outreach and publicity, that's a really big part of some of these things. Nancy, you have your hand raised.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say, just because you can ask for, a certain amount, if your budget is like under that and it's really specific, it shows you did the homework, right? Like you want, like I think that's kind of the sweet spot, is to get as close as you can to that upper range, because I think it lends more credibility to what those numbers actually are. I know that our grant review committee, which are volunteers that spend time poring over them. It's like that is the evidence right there that folks have really added up their expenses, not padded things to such a degree that they're just trying to get that top amount. So, you want to ask for as much as you can, but it really does need to be realistic. So it just thought I would share that.
No, I think that's a really important part. Again, for that's a, I mean, I always think about like an organization working with another organization. That's kind of like, this is a bad example, like, and this is probably 7 p.m. It's kind of like dating, honestly. The more honest you seem to the other organization, the more they're like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And again, the more quote unquote, not shady, but like whatever the word would be, like the more your budget seems like you're kind of ripping them off, the more they'll be like, well, maybe these people are not as honest as what they're sounding. Again, they're trying to find the best fiduciary responsible people for their funding or their resources. And this is a really good example to be like, yeah, we've thought about it. We're not overcharging you. This is why we are making these estimates. And a lot of budgets also ask about assumptions. And that's another good example. Be like, that's what we're assuming, that this is the worst case or this is the best case. Again, the more clearer you are with some of these things, the better it becomes easier. And again, all of these things are important to be thinking about. Steph, do you have a question?
I do, thank you.
Yeah.
I was just curious if it's ever harmful or beneficial if your project scope extends what that particular organization is offering in a grant. Is that okay to say, like, my project is bigger than this, but here's what your dollars would be allocated for?
Yeah, I think that's completely fine. Some organizations are looked like some people are getting multiple funding for their project, but I think it's really important to be like, the amount of money you're putting into this project, this is what it's going towards, The more clearer you are in terms of their money, that's really important. But that's completely fine. This like, this is what we want to do broadly, but this is what we are going to be doing with your money. And again, foundations love, or a lot of grantors love a bigger impact project, but I think you also need to be much more honest as well as realistic about what's happening in a lot of the other spaces. If you say like, hey, I do this work with you for $200, 200 people, and the other part of the funding that has not been funded so far, and I'm looking for funding, they'll be like, yeah, we spend this money on 200 people and the next step doesn't happen, you know. So that's a really good kind of fine line, a thing that you need to kind of be thinking about. But yeah, a lot of organizations are very open to the idea that this is like a seed project, it needs more money in the future, but being as clear as possible about their money is really important. Plus also kind of thinking about, going back to one of the slides, like if you're just saying like, oh, I'll make it sustainable by this money or something like that, the more clearer you are with some of those things, the easier it becomes for the foundation to accept what you're talking about or things like that. Nancy, you also had her hand raised.
Yeah, just to add to that is, if you have a larger project and this foundation you're applying for is like the perfect fit for like a succinct piece of it, you can, in your narrative, say we're leveraging these committed dollars already that we have for this project. And like funders love to know that, like, oh, we are pooling our funds with these other funders that are doing this and they're collectively doing that. So they're making a collective impact. And so when you can demonstrate in a budget or a budget narrative or in your narrative that you're leveraging funds that are already committed, funders love that. It shows that you're being resourceful.
That's a great part. I think the other part, I mean, I also use in some of my grant writing, if you have a big name. So for me, like I applied for an NSF grant, and if part of my project had been funded by NSF, like someone else looks at that and they'll be like, oh, NSF. So same space in that, like if a Meyer is funding some of your work, like one of the bigger ones, it's always good to be like, yeah, this is what they're doing. And again, as Nancy pointed out correctly, that kind of really gives you much more leverage in terms of thinking about some of those things. Yeah, so these are different budget tools that you should be thinking about. I think I also have an example. So this is a great example of a potential budget that may be used. So I think you're kind of putting like requested funds, leverage funds, in-kind donation services times, which is basically volunteering. And if you look at it, this is very specific. You're thinking about critically, like, these are the amount of funds that I'm asking from you. These are the leverage funds, maybe from donation from businesses. These are the $400 in-kind donation that may be coming from another person. And I think it kind of sounds like you're asking them for money, but you're also kind of telling them that you're also kind of thinking about funding this project from a bunch of diverse sources. And again, this shows, and it's a good signal to the funder that you've thought through some of these things, right? Like you're not asking them for everything for the mural artist, but you're also thinking about another grant, like the RACC grant that is helping and the in-kind donation that is helping. And the more evidence you can show, like for instance, in-kind donations, if you can show that you've already accepted, like it was discounted from an organization, that show that you've already kind of worked through some of those things. Again, with this RACC grant, if there's any letter, if there's any evidence that shows that you've already kind of talked through some of those things, again, that shows to the foundation that you've already thought through all the funding mechanism for all those things. Again, much more specific. Again, everybody does differently and everyone has a different thing. Sometimes I would even be like, flyers, $200 for this amount of flyers, and then even breaking it down even more simpler. Again, depends on the foundation and the funder. But those are the things that I kind of do sometimes to make sure that it's even more clear that I've already thought about all of these things. But also knowing that people are busy and you don't have time to like kind of do anything like that. But like those are also things that I would probably be doing in some of those spaces. Uh, any more questions on the budgeting? Because I know, I mean, I teach budgeting all the time, and I know that's often the space where people's eyes just kind of blank out. The only part I would say that hopefully you remember with that is budget is one of the most important part of grants. And honestly, most people that I've ever talked to, they're always looking at those budgets to show your organizational preparedness. So this is like if you do a budget well, you're already getting a lot of points because a lot of nonprofits don't do their budget well, and then they're already flagged. No matter how good of a mission you have, all the other things are good, but if you mess up the budget, people would be less likely to donate to you or fund you. So that's a really important part that I hope you guys are thinking about when you're doing some of these budgeting things. See how I'm doing on time. So yeah, just kind of small things. Again, I just want to keep some time for question and answers, but also some other activities. So try to explain unusual large expenses. Again, something may be costing you a lot. So recently I applied for a grant and I'm getting some software, which is going to cost like maybe $5,000, something like that. So just put it very clearly, like this is the software I'm trying to get, and this is the amount of money they've asked for me. I've even put like their emails or like their whatever the budget they sent to me, just to kind of show like this is what I'm asking for, this is what they're saying, and again that kind of helps for them to explain that. Provide calculation for how you arrived at your estimates. Again, Amazon was a great example if you're doing some paint stuff or whatever. Home Depot could be a good example if you're doing healthcare stuff. There are all of these healthcare resources that can help you to do some of those things. Uh, yeah, let's do some other thing that are like numbers, stuff like that, but I also want to make sure that there's enough time for questions. Uh, yeah, demonstrate thought behind the numbers. Again, going back to the budgets, just thinking through how you have thought about those numbers. Like if you need 50 paint boxes or whatever, how did you come across this number? Like, have you thought about it? Like, have you decided the square footage that you're going to be using for it? Have you thought about like looking at Home Depot, how much it's going to cost? So the more you can show the thought behind the numbers without overwhelming them with details, the better it is. And then match narrative to your project activities, like everything that you're doing. If you're hiring 2 people, you really need to be explaining in the narrative like why you're hiring those people, right? And what are they going to be doing in that project? How are they bringing value to that project? The more clear you are with the narrative, the more easier it becomes for the funder. Not overwhelming them, but providing them enough information to show that you've already thought through all of these budget things. Yeah, I think this is just like some simple processes that happen. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I also want to keep some time for question and answers. Common reasons for rejection. Misalignment with funder priorities I've already talked about. You are working with park and recreation and you're looking for a health funder to kind of fund you. They'll be like, yeah, it's interesting, but we're not aligned with our priorities. It's always good to look at their priorities. What are they interested in? And try to even make what you're pitching for align with some of their priorities without pushing too far. Insufficient evidence, again, if you say like, oh, there's a community need, oh, there's a problem in Saudis. People are like, yeah, there's a problem, but like, what is the evidence to show what's happening? The more clear you are with your evidence or the need for impact, it becomes more clear. Weak organizational capacity, especially with smaller nonprofits, if they don't think that you're capable of doing a project, no matter how great the project is, they're less likely to fund you. And a good example again is like, like I apply for these grants all the time. Like I'm one professor, and if I say like I'll be doing 20 professor worth of work, which I cannot do right now, no matter how good of my project would be, they'll be like, this person is just not capable of doing these things. So it's really good to kind of know what you are able to do. You cannot solve 50,000 houseless people's population with a small nonprofit. But knowing what you can do and aligning that with what you can do and showing your capacity it is more likely to get you that grant. Another thing that is like, like kind of silly, but a lot of people do that, are incomplete applications. If you do not fill the application, some people leave something, especially with government grants, they are very rigorous and bureaucratic. So make sure, at least what I probably tell people is at least get two people to read the application before submitting it, because sometimes we are busy and we are doing other stuff. So make sure that those applications are fulfilled and you've covered all the things. And the last part is unrealistic or unclear budgets. You ask for, you're doing something very small, but you're asking for like $1 million. And they'll be like, yeah, that doesn't make sense at all. Or you're making an unclear budget. You're like, I need $10,000, but you have not really told them what you're going to do with those $10,000. Again, the foundation may be interested in your project, but they're like, this person really doesn't know what they're going to do with that money, because they also need a lot of evidence that their funding is being used appropriately. So kind of having as realistic of a budget as well as clear of a budget really kind of stands you out in all of this grant writing process. Let's see a question. Let's see. Oh, I love that, Andrew. That's a really good one. So okay, I think I'll probably stop here, and I think we can talk about it other thing, but I also want to keep some time for questions and answers. And if you kind of get some time off, we can probably do a quick activity that I had in mind. But maybe let's see if there are questions, comments, anyone else wants to pitch in. Nancy, you can also, feel free to kind of share some of your own experiences, because you've been doing a lot of that as part of Southeast Uplift. So yeah, let's just keep some time for some question and answer if anybody has any specific things, or Nancy, if you want to share some of your own experiences too.
I
All
do
right.
have a tip. My previous job before Southeast Uplift, I was the director of development at Western State Center, and the executive director was fairly new and had come from being a funder, had worked at the Ford Foundation, and
Mhm.
he gave us a great tip. He said, we're going to submit all of our grant applications a week before they're due. So that's our policy. Put them in a week before they're due. He says, as a program officer at a foundation, and quite a large foundation that gets tons of applications, the ones that come in early are few and they're rare, right? So he would be curious, oh, what are the projects coming in? And would read them. And then those became the projects by which the other applications got measured against. And so you sort of, he was saying this is a great strategy for get it in early, set your deadlines accordingly. You may get more attention because they're not wading through a zillion different applications. So I thought that was a really great insider tip. But it is really important, some of the things on this slide, once you do get a grant, I would say the top one is the most important thing, right? When you get a grant, the first thing you want to do is make sure you're really aware of what the reporting requirements are. Because, so for example, Metro has a refresh fund. If you're doing a community cleanup or something, they changed their guidelines from one year to the next. At first, they didn't require photos and things, but then they did. And so if you go through your project and then you look at your reporting requirements later, you would have realized, oh no, we were supposed to take photos of this event to show that we actually did this event. So it's better to start at the outset and really know what you need to do to fulfill the grant report.
And I think that's a really good point. Again, like these are very often like continuous relationships. So it's really important to make sure that all your reporting is great. You're doing all the processes that you're kind of telling them you're doing. And again, these foundations, everybody knows everybody in Portland, honestly. So it's really important to be careful in making sure all the reported requirements are done, document all your progress, keep the funders as much as possible in the loop. Yeah, and consider funders as your partner in your work rather than someone who's just kind of like looking upon your work from a higher space. All of those are really important things. Yeah, I think the other part I think you're mentioning really important is I always advise people to again like submit it early because of the same problems. The laptop may get not working on the last day. Something may happen, life may happen, all of those things. it's always good to submit early, as you're kind of rightly pointing out. That may just give you such a big advantage, but also just making sure that you're submitting early, because just to kind of keep a little bit of gray space for yourself. You never want to be in a space where you want to submit the grant, you've done everything, last minute something happens and everything is gone. You know, that's the other part, especially with governments and stuff too. I think those are very even more bureaucratic. Those are really good points. Anyone else has any questions, concerns, queries? Okay, let's see any hands raised. So we do have a quick activity, but I don't know if we have enough time to do that quick activity, but at least let's at least put it on the screen. What did I do? I'm gonna close my actually close my own screen. Hmm, me. 1 sec. Where's my Zoom?
I feel while you're looking for that, I'll also share, I think as small organizations, there's a real like, oh, we seem like we align, but maybe we do, maybe we don't. Like, let's just go for it. I
Mhm.
think what you really need to ask is that really worth your time, right? If it's a stretch for you to, if you're thinking maybe we're not the best fit, that funder is going to have a lot of applicants that are a great fit. And so, be really selective in what you apply for and really focus on getting those grants rather than spreading yourself really thin, because these can take a lot of time, but you can also recycle the content that you produce for them in other ways and in other applications.
No, I think that's a really good point in kind of thinking about like just overstretching and just kind of making these kind of very far stretch, especially with smaller nonprofits. I think they're already kind of trying to connect with that. And again, yeah, just that kind of leads to a lot of mission creep, because you're just pushing for something. And the other thing I'm always talking about, like, stay true to who you are too, right? I think because everybody is trying to get some of these money and everybody wants to get more funding. And then you don't even remember, like, you kind of go away from the mission that you even started with. So that's another really good point to kind of be thinking about. So again, this is a pretty quick activity. I don't know, Diane, if we have enough time, but I think this is just like a small thing that we want to maybe think about. You guys can think about some of these things as we kind of wrap up our session. Is like just try to think about a fictional nonprofit, think about some problem statements, come up with some funding priorities, do a little bit of budget needs, do some measurable outcomes, just kind of sensing, because I don't know if you have enough time for a group activity. We still have just 4 minutes. But again, this could just be a good activity if you guys want to think about it. Maybe one or two of you may want to talk about one of your own experiences with some of these questions. So I think I'm open to either way, kind of thinking about, but maybe just thinking about some of these questions would be really helpful for the last 4 minutes.
I also just wanted to address something in the chat. So Andrew mentioned, is it also true that if a grantor says no a few times to an applicant, a yes can be harder to get? And I think something that we don't talk about in this or in the grant cycle is sometimes and oftentimes you do get a no. And what do you do back and then adjust your application? Oh, I think I froze. Sorry. But did any of that come through?
No, I think you were
You're
talking.
muted. I
Mhm.
was basically discussing if you don't get a grant, you can always ask for feedback on your application and then come back and adjust your grant application for next time and increase your chances of getting that grant.
I think the other part that's really important is the feedback, right? Like kind of getting a sense of why you were getting rejected for some of that. That's a really important part to understand. And again, I've applied to grant that I got rejected a few times, and again, eventually I got it because I was a little stubborn. But again, that's another question of like, if you get rejected again, is it worth it to put that effort in again? Is it worth to kind of like go through the process again? Those are like good questions to be asking. Is like, am I getting rejected because they're just different from what they are? I'm different from what they're looking for, versus I'm getting rejected because there are certain parts of the project that I could have done better, or their feedback was different, or there's maybe another project that they may be funding. Those are important questions to be considering as you're kind of thinking about some of those things. So yeah, no, I think that'd be, yeah, I don't know, Diane, if you want to add, but I think it's a good idea to apply again, but also making sure you're also optimizing your energy, because especially with smaller nonprofits, there is, capacity issues all the time, which probably every nonprofit has. I think those are important things to be thinking about.
So like in other fields, in other types of fundraising, or you're doing like donor development,
Mm,
and I guess I imagine it's probably different for different grant grantors, like whether they respond to development in a certain way. Like, some grantors are probably like, you're just focused on like creating a really high quality report that gives them exactly the data they want.
mm,
You've got your like data-based, like what's the like efficient philanthropy or whatever it's called, and then you've also got probably the if it's like, especially like a family
mhm.
foundation, if you know the people, you can go to them and say like, hey, here's like, how can we develop this, and like what's important to you, and like treat it more like a donor relationship. I don't know. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I think the donor stewardship is actually one of the most important things, especially with family grants and a lot of those. Like those are, a lot of that is still personal. I think the more we become virtual, I think the more those in-person connections become even more important, honestly. That's
Yeah.
what I'm realizing in all spaces of life right now. So I think that's a great point. Okay, so I think we have reached our time. I'll put my email in the chat box, so please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Happy to chat. I love talking about grants. I love love applying for grants. So please feel free to send an email. And I think I'll be sharing these slides with Diane. So I think you'll also get some of those. The third part is, I think I'm developing some of these webinars. So all of your feedback would be amazing, as I'm kind of really, collecting all of these things, trying to prototype, how to improve some of those things. So any feedback would be really, really helpful. And thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Good luck, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.